Welcome to our channel. In today's video, we're diving into a powerful story about compassion, discipline, and personal transformation. Have you ever faced a moment where your beliefs were challenged and you had to choose between duty and compassion? Well, today we're bringing you a story that does just that, starring none other than Pope Francis and a Swiss guard who finds himself at a crossroads. Before we get started, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on tomorrow's special story. Now, let's get into it. Pope Francis's words that changed a soldier's path forever. In the heart of Vatican City, where centuries-old traditions dictate every movement, Lance Corporal Thomas stood rigid and focused at his post. As a member of the Swiss Guard, he was trained for perfection, conditioned to uphold the honor of his duty with unwavering precision. But beneath the surface of his stoic exterior, a quiet storm brewed, one he had never dared confront. Thomas was just 24, a young man of few words but vast expectations. Since his arrival at Vatican, he had embraced the call of duty with the kind of dedication expected of a Swiss guard. The polished black boots, the pristine red, yellow, and blue uniform, and the ever-present halberd were all symbols of his solemn promise to protect the very heart of the Catholic Church. Yet, in the quiet moments when the crowds disappeared and the streets fell still, Thomas could not shake the feeling of isolation. Though surrounded by his comrades, who also wore the same uniform of discipline, Thomas couldn't help but feel disconnected. His days blurred together, marked only by the unwavering tick of the clock as he stood still day after day. The solitude was almost suffocating. He began to question whether this was all he was meant to do. Stand in silence, unnoticed, a symbol of tradition, but never seen as a human being with needs, desires, and a soul that longed for more than the cold formality of his post. One afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long shadows over St. Peter's Square, an unexpected opportunity arose. Thomas was summoned to the papal residence, where Pope Francis had requested a private meeting with him. This was not a common occurrence. The Swiss Guard was not often summoned to the inner sanctum of Vatican life, let alone to speak with the Pope himself. Thomas, though startled, obeyed the order without hesitation. As he made his way through the hallways, his heart raced. Was this an ordinary meeting, or was there something more? When Thomas entered the room, he was greeted by the warm, yet tired, eyes of Pope Francis. The Pope's voice, as soft as it was commanding, cut through the silence. "Please have a seat, Thomas," Francis said with a smile, gesturing toward a modest chair across from him. The Pope was not behind a desk, not in the position of authority one might expect, but sitting casually, as though speaking to a friend. This unassuming gesture immediately put Thomas at ease. "What brings you to the Swiss Guard?" Francis asked, his eyes kind but piercing. There was a moment of silence as Thomas hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost inaudible. "I don't know, Your Holiness, it's all I've ever done. I stand, I protect, I serve, but sometimes I feel empty, like I'm not seen for who I really am." The Pope listened intently, nodding thoughtfully. After a few moments, he leaned forward slightly. "Thomas, I understand more than you know. When I was younger, I too questioned my place in the world. The rules and traditions we follow are important, yes, but they are not the end of the story. You see, duty is not just about standing still or following orders. It is about serving with love, compassion, and understanding." The Pope's words, simple yet profound, hit Thomas like a wave. In that moment, it was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. Francis continued, "Sometimes the most difficult thing to do is to allow yourself to feel, to be human. And when you are called to serve others, that is when you are truly doing the work God has set out for you." The conversation shifted to deeper topics about faith, sacrifice, and the importance of caring for one's inner peace. Francis shared with Thomas that true service was not about rigid obedience, but about recognizing when to break free from the confines of tradition in order to fulfill a higher calling. Sometimes, Pope Francis said, his voice soft but firm, the most holy thing you can do is not what the world expects. It's what God expects of you in your heart. Do you understand, Thomas? Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and awe. He had come to the meeting expecting, perhaps, a reprimand or praise for his years of service. Instead, he left with something far more valuable, a new understanding of duty, one that transcended the confines of his military training. The meeting with Pope Francis changed Thomas in ways he couldn't yet articulate. No longer did he feel like just another soldier in a long line of tradition. Instead, he felt like a man with a purpose, a man called to serve not just with his actions, but with his heart. As he returned to his post, standing still as ever in the heart of Vatican City, something inside him had shifted. The silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt peaceful. For the first time, Thomas realized that true strength wasn't about standing still for the world to see, but about standing still for the right reasons. That afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas felt a quiet sense of contentment, knowing that his service would always be about more than just duty. It would be about compassion, about humanity, and most importantly, about following his heart in every step he took. Thomas had barely walked out of Pope Francis's room when the weight of the conversation began to settle on him, like a heavy cloak that couldn't be shrugged off. For the first time, he truly questioned everything he had been taught. Duty, honor, tradition, all of it had been so black and white for him before, but now it seemed like there was more, something deeper, he had never considered. As he stood at his post again in the cool shadow of the Vatican walls, the constant hum of life around him felt different. People moved, whispers of conversations filled the air, but it was like he was seeing everything through a new lens. For years, Thomas had prided himself on being the model soldier. Perfectly still, perfectly disciplined, perfectly silent. But what was the point of all this perfection if he felt so disconnected from it? Pope Francis had touched something deep inside him, something he couldn't ignore. The next day, Thomas was summoned again. This time, there was no personal meeting with the Pope. Instead, it was a routine briefing with the rest of the Swiss Guard. They stood in rows, all eyes forward, listening to Commander Schmid as he spoke about the importance of maintaining tradition. During the upcoming religious ceremony, his voice was steady, the words he spoke ingrained in every guard's mind, like an old, well-rehearsed song. Yet as Schmid's voice droned on, Thomas's thoughts wandered. He couldn't help but wonder if the path he was on was the right one. Was standing still, unfeeling, really the highest form of service? His mind flashed back to the Pope's words. Sometimes the most holy thing you can do is not what the world expects. It's what God expects of you in your heart. Suddenly, something snapped inside Thomas. He felt the pull of something greater than duty, something that called him to act. His hand clenched around his halberd, and for a moment the old soldier inside him screamed for him to stop. Don't break the rules. Don't break the code. But the whisper of the Pope's voice in his mind was louder than his own fears. True. Service is not about standing still or following orders. It's about serving with love, compassion, and understanding. In the middle of the briefing, as Schmid emphasized the importance of maintaining perfect stillness, Thomas made a decision. His pulse raced, his chest tightened, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling any longer. It was like a call to action he could no longer resist. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of determination that caught everyone's attention. The room went silent. Schmid turned sharply, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What is it, Bowman?" I can't do this anymore," Thomas said, surprising even himself with the strength of his own words. "I can't stand here pretending. I don't see what's right in front of me." He glanced around the room at his fellow guards, who watched him in stunned silence. He could feel their eyes on him, some confused, some judgmental, but all aware that he had just done something no Swiss guard had ever done before. "What do you mean?" Schmid demanded, taking a step forward. I mean, Thomas took a breath, gathering his courage. That sometimes standing still is not enough. Sometimes you have to move. You have to act when it matters. The room was silent, thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like time itself had stopped. Thomas stood, his ground, every inch of him aching with the weight of his words, but also with a strange sense of peace. He knew what he had to do now. He had to choose humanity over tradition, compassion over rigidity. Schmid's face was a mask of disbelief. "You're betraying everything the Guard stands for," he spat. "You're breaking the code, Bowman." "I'm not breaking the code," Thomas replied, his voice quieter but more powerful than ever. "I'm living it." Schmid's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "Then you're dismissed from the ceremonial division. You won't stand here with us anymore." Thomas nodded, feeling a sharp pang of loss, but not regret. He knew that what he had just done was right, even if it cost him everything he had worked. For Moen, as he turned to leave the briefing room, he felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a deep sense of clarity. When he walked out of the room and into the cold corridors of Vatican, he didn't feel like the same man who had entered. He wasn't the perfect soldier anymore, but maybe, just maybe, he had become something more important. He was a man who could feel, who could act out of love and compassion, who could listen to the higher call. And that, he realized, was what it meant to truly serve. He wasn't sure where this path would lead him, but he knew that, for the first time, he was walking it with his heart wide open. The days following Thomas's bold decision felt like walking in unfamiliar territory. The cold stone walls of Vatican no longer felt like a place of security. They seemed to close in on him, their weight heavier than ever. He wasn't part of the ceremonial division anymore, and every glance from his fellow guards seemed to carry a quiet judgment. There was no turning back now. He had broken the tradition, and the consequences of that were still unknown. For days, Thomas stood guard in the quieter corners of Vatican, away from the grand ceremonies he had once been a part of. The ceremonial duties were stripped from him, replaced by routine patrols through the less glamorous parts of Vatican. The corridors were narrow, the air thick with the scent of old books and stone. It was here, away from the public eye, where Thomas began to wrestle with his decision. He missed the pageantry, the reverence that came with guarding the Pope's most sacred events. But there was something liberating about this new role. This role that wasn't built on perfection or outward display. For the first time, Thomas could breathe without the suffocating pressure of upholding an image, a mask of discipline. But even in this new, quieter life, something was still missing. It wasn't until one evening, as the shadows stretched long across the Vatican gardens, that Thomas began to understand what that something was. He was on a late patrol, walking beneath the ancient trees, when a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Thomas?" He turned to see Father Ventresca, the old priest who had always seemed to be a quiet observer of the guards. He was bent, but there was still a strength in his eyes. His presence was unexpected, yet it felt oddly familiar. "I've been watching you," Father Ventresca said, his voice low. "You made a choice, didn't you?" Thomas looked away, his eyes drawn to the darkening sky. "I did. And now I'm not sure I made the right one. Did the Pope's words not help you?" Father Ventresca asked gently, stepping closer. Thomas was silent for a moment, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. "They did, but it's harder than I thought. I don't know if I'm still who I was supposed to be. I've broken tradition, and now I'm just a soldier with no purpose." Father Ventresca studied him, his gaze steady. "What if I told you, Thomas, that breaking tradition doesn't make you less of a man? It makes you more human." Thomas's eyes snapped to meet the priest's, his chest tightening with emotion. "But that's not what we were trained for. We were taught that loyalty and duty come first. No exceptions." Father Ventresca's lips curved into a faint smile. "And yet, even the greatest loyalty must sometimes bend in the face of a greater calling. What do you think Pope Francis meant when he spoke of serving with love?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thomas had pondered those words. but now they felt like a weight he could no longer escape. I think I was too focused on doing everything right, on fitting into this perfect mold. But love doesn't fit into a mold. The priest nodded, his eyes twinkling. Precisely. Love is messy, unpredictable, and yes, sometimes it means breaking from tradition. But that's the real work, being true to your heart, even when it's not easy. Thomas's mind raced. The world he had known, the life he had led, felt both distant and close all at once. The rigid structure of the Swiss Guard, the discipline that had shaped him, now seemed almost suffocating in the light of Father Ventresca's words. "You've learned a very valuable lesson," Father Ventresca continued, his voice gentle but firm. "To serve with love, to allow your heart to guide you, not to break you. And this is why, despite your doubts, I believe you're on the right path." A quiet peace washed over Thomas as the realization struck him. His decision had been more than a break from tradition. It was a step toward a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve, not just in the eyes of the Vatican, but in the eyes of God and humanity. It wasn't about the uniform, the title, or the role. It was about how he chose to live that role, and how much heart he poured into it. As he stood there in the fading light, Thomas knew that he had not only changed the course of his own life, but had unlocked a truth that could never be undone. The uniform might still be on his shoulders, but the man beneath it, his heart, his spirit, was finally free. And that was something no tradition could ever take away. Father Ventresca, sensing the shift in Thomas, gave him one last piece of, "You're not less of a man, Thomas, you're simply more of a human being. And that is where true service begins." The old priest's words echoed in the stillness of the garden as Thomas continued his patrol, no longer burdened by doubt, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure where this path would lead him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to walk it. Thomas walked through the quiet halls of the Vatican, his mind still buzzing with the conversation he had shared with Father Ventresca. The priest's words had stayed with him, like a quiet hum in the background of his thoughts. "You're simply more of a human being, and that is where true service begins." The more Thomas thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't the uniform, the ceremony, or even the strict discipline that defined him. It was his humanity, his ability to feel, his capacity to break tradition when it served a higher purpose. He felt a strange sense of relief, but also a nagging sense of uncertainty. What now? Was there a place for him in the Guard, or had he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? The days following his conversation with Father Ventresca were both quiet and tumultuous. Though he was no longer part of the ceremonial Guard, the other soldiers looked at him with a mixture of sympathy, confusion, and, in some cases, judgment. They had always admired Thomas's dedication to duty, his unflinching commitment to tradition. But now, as he patrolled the quieter halls of the Vatican, he saw the distance in their eyes. They didn't understand. How could they? Then, one evening, as he walked the perimeter of the Apostolic Palace, a familiar figure approached him, Commander Schmid. His face was unreadable, his posture as rigid as ever. Thomas braced himself, knowing that this conversation was coming, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for it. "Lance Corporal Bowman," Schmid began, his voice cold but not unkind. "We need to talk." Thomas didn't respond immediately. The weight of the past few days pressed down on him, and he wondered if this would be the moment when his actions finally caught up with him. He nodded silently, following Schmid to a small, dimly lit room tucked away from the main halls. The room felt suffocating, like it had been prepared for this very conversation. Once inside, Schmid turned to face him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What you did," he said slowly, "was an act of defiance. You broke tradition. You broke a code we've upheld for centuries." Thomas swallowed hard, but he didn't flinch. He had known this moment was coming. He had known there would be consequences. But he also knew that what he had done was right. He wasn't sorry. "I didn't break the code, sir," Thomas said quietly. "I honored it. I honored it in a way that matters more than tradition. I did what I believed was right. Schmid's eyes hardened, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of something almost like understanding. You're speaking of compassion, Bowman, but compassion cannot replace duty. Duty is what holds this institution together. Without it, we have nothing. Thomas felt his chest tighten, but he refused to back down. Sometimes, sir, he said, his voice steady, duty means doing what's right, even when it means breaking from what we've always done. If we only stand still, following orders blindly, then we are no better than the walls we guard. Pope Francis taught me that. There was a long silence as Schmid stared at him. Thomas's heart raced, but he stood firm. This wasn't the moment to back down. This wasn't about tradition anymore. It was about something deeper, something more human. Finally, Schmid spoke, his voice quieter this time. I can't condone your actions, Thomas. The Guard is built on tradition. But, he paused, studying Thomas with an intensity that made him feel like the room had narrowed. I do understand why you did it. You were following a higher calling, not just for yourself, but for something greater than all of us. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. Was this approval? Was Schmid, his commanding officer, the embodiment of everything Thomas had once aspired to, actually saying he understood? You're not dismissed from the Guard, Schmid continued, his voice firm but with a hint of respect. But you'll no longer serve in the ceremonial division. You'll be reassigned. There is a place for you here, Bowman, but you'll have to earn it on your terms, and from now on you will be watched closely. Thomas felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief, confusion, and a deep sense of gratitude. He hadn't expected this, but he wasn't surprised either. The Guard was a place of tradition and loyalty, but it was also a place of humanity. The walls that had surrounded him for so long had cracked, just a little. I understand, sir, Thomas said, his voice calm but his heart pounding in his chest. And I will do my best to serve, in whatever way I'm needed. Schmid nodded, his expression softening just slightly. Good. That's all I ask. As he left the room, Thomas felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for the first time in years he wasn't afraid of it. He had made his choice, and whatever the future held, he would walk it with his heart open, ready to serve with love, not just duty. The night settled over Vatican City. Thomas knew that the walls were no longer closing in on him. He had found his way out, not through defiance but through compassion, through the very humanity that had once been a silent prisoner inside him. The following days felt like a blur for Thomas. His reassignment to a quieter, more obscure part of the Vatican was a stark contrast to his previous, more visible role as part of the ceremonial Swiss Guard. Now, he spent his days in shadowed halls, patrolling the less traveled corridors of the Apostolic Palace. While the work itself was just as demanding, it lacked the grandeur of his previous duties. But for the first time in his life, Thomas felt a sense of freedom. The heavy armor of expectation had been replaced with something lighter, his own sense of purpose. His interactions with the other guards became sparse. Some of them avoided him, still unsure about the decision he had made, while others seemed to watch him with a quiet curiosity, as if waiting to see what he would do next. The room where he now found himself assigned was far from the majestic surroundings of St. Peter's Square, but it had its own quiet beauty. The shadows that stretched along the walls no longer seemed suffocating. They felt like a place for introspection. One evening, after a long shift, Thomas sat alone in a small courtyard, the silence broken only by the distant hum of Vatican life. The cool air brushed against his face as he leaned back against a stone wall, deep in thought. He had come to terms with his reassignment, but a nagging feeling lingered in his chest. What was next for him? Had his decision truly been the right one? Or had he simply acted on impulse, too eager to escape the rigid confines of tradition? He was no longer the model soldier, the one who had been revered for his perfect discipline. In many ways, he, felt like an outsider in the very place he had sworn to protect. Just then, Father Ventresca appeared, as quietly as he always did. The priest's presence felt like an anchor in the storm of Thomas's thoughts. He walked over to where Thomas sat sitting beside him without a word. For a few moments, they both just watched the sky darken, the golden light fading from the horizon. Finally, it was Father Ventresca who broke the silence. "You've been thinking about your decision," he said gently. Thomas nodded. "I don't know if it was the right choice, Father. I broke from everything I knew. I stepped away from the tradition that defined me, and now I'm not sure what I am anymore." The old priest smiled softly, his gaze warm yet piercing. "You're still you, Thomas, but you're a different version of yourself now, a version that understands the true meaning of service." Thomas turned to look at him, his brow furrowed. "But I'm not the same as I was before. I can't go back to what I was doing before, and I don't know if I want to." Father Ventresca's eyes softened. "And you don't need to go back. Sometimes breaking free from tradition is the very thing that allows us to serve more fully, more honestly. But it's not an easy road. You've found a new path, but it will test you in ways you can't yet understand." A heavy silence settled between them, as though both men were weighing the weight of what had been said. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't want to disappoint anyone. I don't want to lose the respect of the guard, or worse, lose the respect of the Pope. But I also know that what I did was right." Father Ventresca placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Respect comes from the heart, Thomas. You've already earned it. Not just because you stand at attention, but because you acted when it mattered most. You're serving in a way that very few men can claim to understand. And that is what will leave a lasting legacy. Not the uniform, not the position, but the person you've become." Thomas let those words settle into him, feeling their truth wash over him. For the first time since his reassignment, he felt a quiet peace. The weight of his decision, heavy as it had been, no longer felt like a burden. It was his truth, something no one could take away from him. He had chosen a path not just of service, but of compassion, of seeing the deeper meaning in his duty. And while he was no longer in the spotlight, no longer in the ceremonial divisions where the world's eyes could watch him, Thomas knew that his service would resonate far beyond the walls of Vatican. Father Ventresca stood up, his movements slow but graceful. "It's not about fitting into a role, Thomas. It's about making the role fit who you are." Thomas stood up as well, the weight in his chest lifting just a little more. "Thank you, Father," he said softly. The priest smiled, his eyes twinkling with wisdom. "You're welcome, Thomas. Now go out there and live the life you've chosen. You've earned the right to walk your own path." And as Thomas walked back toward his new quarters, the sound of his footsteps no longer felt heavy. For the first time in years, they felt like steps taken with purpose, steps that would lead him, not back to where he came from, but forward to where he was meant to go. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk, with his heart leading the way. We hope this story resonated with you, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thomas's journey of breaking tradition, finding his humanity, and choosing a path of compassion over rigid discipline is a powerful reminder that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest personal growth. Have you ever faced a moment in your life where you had to break free from tradition to follow what you believed was right? What did that experience teach you? Let us know in the comments below. We love reading your stories and hearing about the challenges you've overcome and how they've shaped the person you are today. Also, if this story made you reflect on your own values and the choices you make in life, don't forget to share your thoughts and reactions with us. Your opinions matter, and they inspire us to keep creating content that speaks to the heart. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss out on tomorrow's special story. Let's keep the conversation going. Share your perspective, your experiences, and let's discuss how sometimes embracing our humanity is the key to living a life full of purpose and compassion.